It is. He's got it. He's DNA. I've been hanging around this man for what, 3 years? It's in his DNA.
Fortunately, a fair chunk of this content I already created years ago when we did the first group.
Oh, okay. That's good.
So, a fair chunk of this, probably 60-ish% of this content I already have. I just repurpose it. And quite frankly, I shrink it down a lot because we took 2 years to go through everything. And okay, let's take a breath. It's been a busy, hectic day. So let's just briefly recap. For the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about interpretation, right? We started with observation, which is just all about learning to see well, making sure that we have done our diligence in the text to identify important facts, people, places, events, repeating words and phrases, maybe begin to summarize our units of thought, which for our purposes and practically speaking, you can tend to just use the paragraphs that your Bible already indicates for you. That's a decent place to start. And so we've done some of that. And then we turn the corner from observation to interpretation, which is all about getting to the meaning, right? Observation, we're just flipping over puzzle pieces and we're kind of grouping the pieces together. In interpretation, we're starting to construct the picture or putting the pieces together so that we can begin to see what the image is. So we can begin to get to the meaning. Last week, we talked in depth about word studies and not just the importance of word studies, but a little bit around the how-to and some of the tools that we have access to and some of the things that we can use nowadays for that. Today, we're going to continue talking about interpretation. This is our last session on interpretation, and we're going to talk about context. And I'm sure you guys have heard me say this before, but since we're talking about context, this is the place to say it again. Out of all the things that we talk about in this entire session, context is the single most important thing out of everything we're going to talk about. Everybody's familiar with the golden rule of real estate: location, location, location. Same thing with biblical interpretation. The most important thing is context, context, context. I cannot overemphasize enough that we would resolve many a poor interpretation if we would simply take a step back and work more diligently to understand the context that our passage is in. So this is a biggie, which is why you have some extra content that we put into the appendix around dispensations and around literary structure. We'll touch briefly on both of those as we go through some of this content. But so we're really, really from the last week, we were talking about words and maybe a little bit around clauses and sentences. Today in this circle, we're talking about immediate context and how that fits within the thrust of the book, how dispensations fit into that. And then things like history, geography, and customs, those are all issues of context. It's just geographical context, historical context, social context, those type of things. Today, we're going to talk about some of those briefly, but we're going to focus mainly on that notion of immediate context. That's the biggie we want to get through. But kind of starting from the outside of the circle and working our way in, let's talk a moment about historical context. I think most people know this if you've been in the church for a bit, right? The text of the Bible from its first writing to Revelation spans about a 2,000-year time frame. So when we're thinking about historical context, this is just a list of some questions in any given text that you may want to ask. And historical context is probably a more important deal when you're in the Old Testament than when you're in the New Testament, right? Because the historical context of the New Testament is pretty compressed. right? The entirety of the New Testament is roughly 30-ish, 40-ish years. And maybe you can expand it to 100, depending upon when we think John wrote Revelation. But the net of it is, in less than a 100-year time frame, the entirety of the New Testament occurs. That leaves about 1900 years for the rest of the scriptures to unfold. So there's a lot of historical context in that Old Testament. But questions like, are any historical figures mentioned? Who is God working? How is God working with Israel? Is Israel in the promised land? Are they in captivity? Are they even a nation yet? You know, those kind of questions. And I won't go through the examples just for the sake of time, but Ezekiel 37:25 mentions David, and we're trying to figure out which David, what David. Is that the David we all think when we hear the name David? Make sure you don't make assumptions around who we think it is. Geographical context, again, Old Testament, things like, is Israel in the promised land? Is the geography being mentioned? You know, where is it? Who runs that territory at that point in time? Acts 1:8, important things happen as the apostles move into these different geographical regions, right? Acts 1:8 is around the dispersion. And that's, you know, Acts is the historical record of the beginning of the church. And so we see the fulfillment of the go to all the nations, and we see different apostles going to different locations. Corinthians, what do we know about the location of the city? How might that impact our understanding of what Paul was writing to them about? You know, there's often geographical clues about a given city that help us understand the culture or the societal aspects of a given city, which can help us understand why Paul was writing the way he was writing to the Corinthians, which we know the Corinthians were just a mess and had a lot of immorality going on there because of what kind of city Corinth was. Cultural context, right? It's a very different culture than our own. Oh, I should get rid of that reference. LTTS is Let the Text Speak. That was the book we were using for the prior class. So you can mark through that unless you want to go get that book. If you have that book, then on page 54, there are some additional resources. Questions like, who's the audience? And there's often more than one audience. You know, there could be an immediate person. Jesus is speaking to a person. There could be other people in the peripheral of that conversation. Something like Philippians, we're told pretty much at the beginning who it's written to. But even within who it's written to, the given passage you're reading may be addressing a very specific individual or group of people. So who's the book written to? Sometimes it's stated, sometimes it's not. And often there can be a secondary audience as needed. Dispensational context. This is one of the things that I put in the appendix because we just don't have time to get into it to any great extent in here. But the very, very short version of the notion of dispensations is that God works with different people in different ways at different times. Basically, you know, the way God interacted with mankind in the garden was different than post-garden and different post-flood and different post-kings being set up. You know, there were different, they're often called economies. There were different time periods in which God interacted with people differently. And those are just kind of referred to as dispensations. And so depending upon what part of the Bible you're reading, having an understanding of what kind of dispensation you're in, meaning in what way would God typically be interacting with those people at that time, can shed some light on a given passage, or can also help you understand why a passage might be, again, applicable to that original audience, but we kind of have to realize that the, you know, direct application might be different for us just because we're not in that dispensation.
What do you mean by like God
being the fire over the ark when he was with the children of Israelites and God speaking in to Moses. Do you mean his different forms that he speaks with people?
That could be a part of it, but it's probably more around the what's the easiest way to I want to say government, but that's probably not the best word. Just think of, like during the dispensation of kings, God worked through the hierarchy of the kings and the priests. But before there were kings and priests, you have, the call of Abraham. And so the way God interacted was, in essence, through pretty direct interaction with Abraham. And that was distinct and different than the way he dealt with his people when there were kings. And there were, even before there were kings, there were priests. There was the notion of Moses and the temple being set up, and that's a different dispensation. And
When I hear the word dispensation, I think of like Catholicism. I think
Right.
of the priest giving dispensation, so it's not that.
No.
It's not like erasing your sins for certain.
No.
acts. It's more his form of interacting.
Yeah, it's kind of the means by which he governs his people in a given time frame. Sometimes he did it, directly, as in the garden.
Means of government.
Yeah. Now we're starting to get into some context things that we've already done some work with, down to 6, purpose or theme of the book, right? Typically, each book of the Bible is written for a purpose. Even Old Testament books tend to have a very specific purpose or theme. And, getting an understanding of what that purpose or theme is, again, just helps us make sure that we're not misinterpreting a given passage out of that book in a way that violates the purpose of the book. We want to make sure that we're interpreting in harmony with the purpose or theme of a given book. I think, because I've been trying to do some more thinking about this, in the winter, spring, if we do a 2.0 version of this, I want to use the book of 1 John. Mainly because I chose Philippians for this one because, quite frankly, Philippians doesn't have very much controversial content in it. It's pretty straightforward. There's very little content in which people disagree on. 1 John, on the other hand, has some challenging passages in it, has some passages that people have disagreements on, see very differently. And I purposely wanted to choose a book that was a bit more challenging, just to allow us to have some more conversation around that. So here, as an example of understanding the purpose of a book, and again, let me preface all of this with my current understanding is that if I were to write the purpose statement for 1 John, to me, the book of 1 John is about the concept of fellowship as opposed to the notion of using works for assurance. These are the two primary contrasting views on the book of 1 John. Some people use the book of 1 John as a way to say you must have good works in order to demonstrate that you are a believer. And I lean more towards, I think the book is about fellowship and our need to stay in fellowship in order to demonstrate the love of God to others. So the way in which you define a purpose statement for that book can obviously impact the way you start interpreting individual passages under it, right? If I interpret the purpose of 1 John as it's the book telling me I have to have good works to demonstrate any sense of assurance of my faith, that's going to color and filter the way I start interpreting individual passages. So we just have to recognize that and do what we can to come to an honest, personal understanding of what we think the purpose is. As I've said before, following these guidelines do not guarantee we will all come to the exact same interpretation. I do think it improves the likelihood of that, and it at least gives us a better foundation to then begin to have conversations if we do differ. Matthew, as another example, answers the question, if Messiah has come, why do we still wait for his kingdom? The notion of the Messiah has arrived and the kingdom of God is now is a big theme throughout the book of Matthew. Then development of the book's argument or narrative. So again, this ties a lot into what we've been doing, where we've been trying to summarize the units of thought or the paragraphs throughout a book. Because ultimately we're trying to understand, is there a guiding narrative, or often in the epistles, some kind of an argument that, Paul might be making, or one of the authors is really making, that the book centers around. We need to look for clues that indicate when an author is concluding a point or a section and moving on to another point. This comes back to there was no syntax in Greek, right? So the only way a reader would know he's done with that point and he's moving to this point is because of a shift in the content that clues the reader into, oh, okay, he's done with that point. Now he's starting to make a new point. And we have gotten very comfortable with using like paragraphs or verses, or you know how sometimes in your Bible it'll put like a 1 or 2 word summary over a chunk of text. The fancy technical word for that is a pericope. And pericopes are other things that make it really easy for us to get a little lazy when it comes to what's this, unit of thought, because we can just glance at a pericope and say, oh, this chunk of text is about that. Which again, most of the time the translators have done a really good job for us, and that's probably correct. But always do that homework yourself as well. And then immediate context. The immediate context of any verse in the Bible has a great impact on its meaning and uses. I mean, this is just, I can't say it enough. This is probably one of the single most important things we'll learn in the 12 weeks we're going to be together. Just this notion of, if you do nothing else, if you're reading a single verse and you're like, I don't fully understand that, I beg of you, read the verse before it and the verses after it. And don't stop there. Read the paragraph before and the paragraph after at a minimum. And we're going to actually do that a bit in our exercise a little later. So as a good example, if we look at just the verse Romans 14:21, don't eat meat or drink wine and make your brother stumble, right? If you just read the verse, that's kind of the gist of the verse. Don't eat meat, don't drink wine, because you don't want to make your brother stumble. If that was the only thing I told you, that's a pretty hard and fast, feels like a rule, no problem. But if you go back and you look at the prior content, 14:1 through 14, it's talking about this notion of how to express your Christian liberty. Not legalism, but the liberty that we have. And then you look after in 15 through 21, well, that's actually still before 14:21. And it's talking about how to express Christian liberty with love and sensitivity. So just by reading the rest of that chat from 1 down, we understand that we're talking about Christian liberty and how to express your Christian liberty with love and sensitivity. So when you put, hey, it's slim and mighty today.
About the Gentiles, and don't get caught up in the rules of dietary restrictions and stuff.
Yeah, and
part of what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's more context than even what we've read, because the whole reason this is even a thing is because they've just kind of drafted this letter to talk about what the Gentiles, should and shouldn't do and all that kind of stuff. But it's all still in this context of, we understand that as believers, we have liberty. We're under grace and we have liberty, and there's, we're not under the law anymore. We don't have to do these hard and fast, rule-based kind of things. But that said, we don't want our liberty to become a stumbling block to other people. And as a result of that, based on the circumstance and the situation that you're in and the people that you're around, it's okay to set your liberty aside and don't eat the meat or don't drink the wine if you feel like in the certain situation it may cause somebody to stumble.
For me, alcohol used to be a big deal, like you're talking about stumbling block and drinking wine and, as a Christian, we were always told you shouldn't consume alcohol as a beverage or something else. I forget what the church covenant said. But then there were people going like, there's nothing in scripture that says now you can have a glass of wine every now and then. So
Yeah.
you had to make the decision, okay, do it in your home. That's what I was always taught. You want to drink alcohol, just do it in your home. Don't do it outside where you would, like you said, confuse people.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is if, again, if I only look at 1421, I don't understand its context. It's really easy for us to make it a bylaw in the church or, whatever, to make it legalistic so that we just kind of draw the line in the sand and say, well, look, we don't want anybody to stumble because of our action. So just don't ever do it. But that's not what Paul's saying. Paul is saying, be aware. Yeah. Read the room. Be aware of your surroundings and know that you have liberty. Just don't let your liberty, to the best of your ability, cause somebody else to stumble, because obviously we should care more about them than our liberty. But caring more about them doesn't erase our liberty, doesn't remove our liberty. It just means we're responsible as to how we use that liberty. 9, value of literary structure to biblical interpretation. So literary structure is another thing that I gave you handouts for the appendix. Both dispensationalism and literary structure is a lot of good content that I put in the appendix, but things kind of relevant to literary structure. One, it helps us appreciate the extreme care that went into crafting each book of the Bible. Tim Mackey, Bible Project, is fond of saying the biblical authors were literary ninjas. It is just mind-blowing at the level of intricacy and detail, both in the Old Testament and the New, that these, writers put into the text. And obviously, we know it was also through the impetus of the Holy Spirit, but these, unlike us that are so busy and so distracted, most often the people that were doing this writing, it's all they did. It was their life. It can help us gain a better understanding of the author's intention. And when we say literary structure, just think grammar. Right. This is when we start getting into the verb tenses and the moods. And when we get into, all these different parts of speech that we talked about some last week, that's all part and parcel of literary structure. Literary structure also has the notion of how did they actually structure the overall book? Is it an argument and they've got point A, B, and C? Is it, just a letter and they've got a couple of steps? Is it a parable? Is it a poem? What kind of literary, not just genre, but actual grammatical structure were they using? Probably one of the most common and popular structures. We've used this word before, but we haven't talked about it much. There's an example of it in the literary structure appendix thing, is a chiastic structure. A chiastic structure is typically when you have, it typically follows some kind of A prime, B prime, C prime, and then it's going to be C part 2, or what they call that, and A kind of thing. You've got this and this kind of a line, and this kind of a line, and these kind of a line. And sometimes you might have a D right in the middle, and this is really the main point. There's a few different ways they can do this structure, but it's a symmetry. And the main point of a chiastic structure is always that whatever's in the middle is the most important point. That's why they use a chiastic structure, is because they're building to a point. and they're going to get you to the point, and then they're going to back their way out of that point.
Like, with this year, Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah,
The center of the center of the.
that's
center.
right. Yeah, the whole Sermon on the Mount kind of follows a chiastic structure. And you will often see that entire books are written in some form of a chiastic structure. And then even within a chiastic structure, so you might take a look at, just B here, and depending upon how long this is, it could have a mini chiastic structure inside of it. It was a very common structure. Again, no grammar, no syntax back then. So it was these kinds of things that helped the audience, they were kind of looking for these kind of structures because they knew these were common methods of helping them understand where the point was. This is not the way we tend to write, so it's a little foreign to us, but very, very common in the text.
Is the parable more like a tag?
I don't know the relationship between a parable and a chiastic structure. I would assume some parables may follow a chiastic structure, but I think parables are a bit unique in the sense that they're, more of a story kind of format, whereas this is more of a, like we would call an outline. This is their outline, but their outlines had this structure to it, whereas our outline is just, 1, 2, 3 kind of thing. Theirs has this kind of mirrored path down to a middle point. Structure can help us clarify the meaning of the text. It can help us identify emphasis. Again, this is a great example. Whatever's in the middle, this is what they're emphasizing. Can help us avoid reading ideas into the text that are not intended. That's another great benefit of a chiastic structure, is it kind of helps you understand the argument and the flow of thought. And so again, if I'm here interpreting this verse and I interpret it in some way that really violates the overall structure of this, then I'm probably doing eisegesis, right? I'm probably reading something into that as opposed to paying attention to the context that it sits in. Helps add depth to your understanding of the books. And then we put some of that in the appendix. And I did want to just take one moment. I'm going to actually pull up the literary structures. And I just want to quickly show you on the second page. This is just kind of a sample, just so you know something to reference. It is a type of parallelism. Literary tool in which lines or phrases are arranged in an ascending and then descending structure. Typically, it's a cyclical structure, A, B, C, C, B, A. Simple example. Sometimes chiasms have different structures like A prime, B prime. That's more of an identical parallel versus an antithetical parallelism. A good example, Ephesians 4, verses 3 through 6. There is one body, one spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling and one Lord. And then you start backing out, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father. And, faith and hope kind of go together, and baptism and the Spirit kind of go together, and one God and Father of all, and in you all is one body. Sometimes they can be hard to see. And again, we don't have some guide from the first century that says, here's what my chiastic structure was, right? We're subjectively trying to say, this feels like a chiastic kind of structure. So you have to take all of that with a bit of a grain of sand, but some things feel like they fit much nicer into that kind of a structure than others. So I just wanted to highlight that one. let's jump over to the, should be page, I think, 41, which should it say partial example at the top?
Mhm.
So, this is a partial example using the book of First John that I debated on even putting in here because, as I was explaining earlier, I think I want to do the book of First John if we do a 2.0 version of this class. And so part of me didn't want to give away work that's valuable to that, but I think it's really helpful to have an already done kind of example that's not in Philippians, so that because for the suggested do more if you want at home stuff, I guess I can say homework since David's not here. It would be great if you tried to do this for Philippians, and I'll show you the exercise that kind of put together in a moment. So here, for example, I wanted to study a little deeper on the verse, 1 John 4:18. The verse simply says, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. So let's say that's the verse that you want to dig into a bit more. And we're going to make the assumption that you've already done your observations. You've already done your, what are the primary facts about the book? You kind of already know who the author is and when it was written, and you know the basic observation kind of things. And I'll go so far as to say, ideally, not 100% necessary, but ideally, you've already kind of done your paragraph summaries. You've already gotten a sense of what is the flow of thought throughout the book, and what are the summaries for each of the units of thought or paragraphs through the book. Right? And that's just kind of like whenever I'm starting a new study of a book, because I tend to study books as a whole nowadays, as opposed to a passage in a book. I'll study the book first, at least from an observation standpoint, and then I'll start to dig into passages that I felt uncomfortable with, or that I didn't understand well, or that just felt complicated. I'll go back and do what we're doing here with those kinds of passages. So we want to look at the immediate context. And by immediate context, what we mean is simply this. You're going to have your main verse. Right? This is the passage you want to study. You're going to have your main verse. And that verse typically sits inside of a paragraph, a unit of thought. Right? But it's going to have typically a sentence or two, often a sentence above it and a sentence below it. Right? So this is the above sentence. This is my below sentence. And all of this is still in the one paragraph. Then there's going to be a paragraph above. And there's going to be a paragraph below. Now, we all know that there might be a whole bunch of paragraphs below and a whole bunch of paragraphs above. But at a minimum, this is the immediate context. The immediate context is within the unit of thought, paragraph, that this verse lives. Is there anything above it or below it? And then for this unit of thought, what is the immediate paragraph above it and below it? At a minimum, that's your target zone. You got to get through that. Otherwise, you're really risking your ability to properly interpret this. Now, ultimately, we want to make sure that the way we interpret this holds true to the overall theme of the book, right? Because we might have an unlimited, we're going to have more paragraphs up here, we're going to have more paragraphs down here, but in the end, we have a book. Right. And we do also want to make sure that, again, the way we interpret this is holding true to the overall theme or purpose of the book. And this is just like if somebody said you have one day, 1 2-hour session to teach everything you could possibly teach about biblical interpretation, this is the lesson we would do. It's just the most important thing. Out of this, if you've already done your observation, you may already know if there are any words or phrases in this verse that the author has already used multiple times. You might already have a sense of the repeating phrases. If you've already got a decent sense of the unit of thought for the book or the flow of thought for the book, you'll already kind of have an idea of where is this in the development of his overall, is he making an argument for something? Is he, Paul is very good about doing a handful of theological lessons and then switching gears into the practical application of that. Many of his letters follow that format. All of this just like big puzzle, and you're just, observation, you're flipping all those pieces over. Now we're going to dig in, and we might do word studies on things that are in here, which is why we talked about that some last week. But ultimately, this immediate context, so whenever you just hear that notion of what's the immediate context, that this structure should come to mind. Understand the unit of thought that it's contained in. Understand the immediate sentence above and below it at a bare bones minimum. And then ideally the paragraph above and below. If you can get that much done, you'll probably be in good shape. And what you may likely find is that when you start digging into this paragraph, there's a pretty good chance that that paragraph is going to start with a word like therefore, which immediately means you got to go up one more to figure that out. And this is when we start to see, and Paul's really good about doing this, is typically his whole letters are a series of therefores. It's all a connected thought, which is why if you've already done your chapter summaries or your paragraph summaries, you kind of already know what that therefore is there for.
Be like in Philippians, we kind of like focus on the main verse. My God shall supply all your need. But that is connected to when you go back above where he says, I've learned in whatsoever state I am.
Right.
That I may win Christ, so it's like, even though you're looking at that main verse, but you have to pay attention to the prior one.
Absolutely. Your interpretation must, the meaning that you derive must be within the context that passage sits in. Mm-hmm. If you're giving a meaning to that passage that does not fit with the immediate context, you are doing it wrong.
You impose your interpretation.
You're doing eisegesis instead of exegesis. Mm-hmm. You're reading something into the text as opposed to letting the text read something out to you. So 1 John 4:18. So let's do it this way. I'm going to come down to, here's the main sentence, immediate context. That's all right, man. Come on in. No problem. So we're looking at 4:18, right? There is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. So these are just kind of the habits that I've formed. You can kind of do whatever is comfortable for you. I keep refining this a little bit more and a little bit more because I am a highly OCD, very detail oriented, and I like structure. So it just helps me to, get some sense of, I know the blanks I'm trying to fill in. So I have a template that kind of helps drive the way I go through this process. So I just have underneath that passage what I start with. I'll start with what are my insights for this passage in and of itself. So for this one, there is no fear in love. I just take that first little phrase. Simple statement of fact. Love, as defined by God, does not contain any element of fear. That is, fear of being punished at the day of judgment, right? And I know that because of prior context, which we're going to look at in just a second. Then the word but. Now, this is a contrast, as if to say, but if you do have fear, then the way then they way, that's not right. Then the way, yes, let me just go ahead and fix that right now. Then the way to get rid of it is for your love to be perfected. And then I'll say to myself, I need to do a little better word study on perfected, right? I want to understand what that word means. Then next phrase, perfect love casts out fear. So again, just based on the reading, what I already knew, he has already mentioned that this, right? He's saying, where's the this in this? Oh, that's from a prior verse. Okay. Back up in 17. He has already mentioned that this, and this is a pronoun for the concept of fellowship, which is why I have fellowship in parentheses, is perfecting love with us in 4:17. So the concept of fellowship is the thing driving the notion of perfecting love. Now he's stating that this perfected past tense love has a result of casting out fear, which ties back to his statement that there is no fear in love. So I'm basically just following a logic flow based on the prior passages that helps me understand the context of this passage. And then because, right, because we're kind of up at the because fear involves punishment. The reason that perfected love casts out fear is because fear involves punishment, meaning the person who still fears being punished at the day of judgment is proving that their love has not been perfected. Point being, if you still fear punishment on the day of judgment, then your love needs further perfecting, as the one who fears is not perfected in love. So I'm trying to wrap my head around what I think this particular verse means. And I'm just breaking it down into little clauses. I'm understanding the buts and the becauses and the contrast. I'm trying to tie words back to things that he's already talked about. So let's take a step back and go to immediate context, the sentence before. So now we're looking at 4:17. By this, there's that this, love is perfected with us so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment. So, right, here's this concept of confidence at the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. So now I'm going to do the exact same thing with this sentence that I did with 18. I'm just going to make an inside section. I'm going to say, okay, let's talk about this. By this, and I even said, I need to understand what this points back to. And then I put in parentheses fellowship, because that's what I think it points back to. This fellowship is what's causing the love is perfected with us, right? By this, so whatever this is, that this is doing the perfecting of love. So it's really important to know what the this is. And why is that thing, I'm for now, let's just call it fellowship. Because that, to the best of my current understanding, that's what I believe that this is referring to. It's referring to the concept of fellowship. So we could say, by your fellowship with one another, by the way you love one another in fellowship, love is perfected or matured or brought to maturity. Why? So that there's a purpose. We may have confidence in the day of judgment. Why is that? Because as he is, so also are we in this world. Or you could say, as he was and is to the world, so we are to the world. just as he expressed the love of the Father in his fellowship to the world, so we are to do that. Now, I'm expressing a lot of interpretation already because I've done the reading and the work above, kind of thing, but we're going to keep making our way back. So we get down to the because, right? The reason we can have confidence in the day of judgment is as he is, so also that's a comparison. Are we in this world? So then I look at each piece as he is. This asks the question, what is he? Implies to have the same quality of being, which is that of love. And then in this world, the context of the being, just as he is, right? Because E is a, is a stative verb. It's a being kind of verb. So just as he is being in this world, we are the same as him in this world, meaning as he was love, so we are to be love in this world. So let's now go back to the first half of the unit of thought. So we're here. Yeah, we've done the main verse. We've done the verse right above it. We're now really finishing the paragraph. We're not to the paragraph above it. We're still in the paragraph that contains our main verse. But I'm going to finish that. So when I say immediate context, main unit of thought, that's this line right here. This is our main unit of thought, or the paragraph containing our main verse. So I'm trying to get to a summary of this paragraph. I want a summary of that paragraph. So I wrote, abiding in love is to abide in God and for him to abide in us, which brings love to complete maturity and removes the fear of punishment from the day of judgment. The maturity of love is demonstrated in how we love our fellow believers. Now, please note the irony that my summary is not only multiple sentences, it's 2 parts, which violates a lot of what I've been saying to you, which is to try to get your summary short. It's all subjective. Short is always good, but sometimes you gotta write a little bit more. And then the second part, a mature love demonstrated in how we love others removes our fear of being judged. That was my summary of that overall unit, which would include the below passage. So let's just jump down to the below passage real quick. The sentence after verse 19, we love because he first loved us. Short and sweet. So again, I just kind of try to break it down. We love, that's just a simple statement of fact. That's a little bit of, is there any, you could look up the word love. It's a verb. You could see what aspect it is. Is it internal, external? We talked about aspects last week. What's the tense? What's the voice? What's the mood? All of that kind of helps me conclude that's just a simple statement of fact. We love. But then there's a reason why we love, because the reason we love is because he first loved us.
Before you jump to 5.
Yeah.
In the review of that, it's not I'm confused. I thought it was interesting that in the understanding or the description of love throughout these verses, and I understand who is love and love is perfect, but then it jumped to the day of judgment. Was that a cultural thing that there was a fear of judgment of what in which love had to cover? Because I just think it's interesting. We're here and then we go,
right. Why is Paul even bringing up this notion of the day of judgment? Right. Yeah. Yeah, that is a great question that a thorough reading would immediately make you ask, because it's like, what is this day of judgment? Why? Is there a possibility that I might be afraid at a day of judgment? Because my whole Christian upbringing, I was just told you believe and you die and you go to heaven and you're in the happy place. There was quite some time into my understanding of theology before I even understood the notion of a judgment seat of Christ. And is that something for believers? Is that for unbelievers? Are there multiple judgments? Okay, that's a whole conversation in and of itself, which I have my own views on. That's a whole different class.
I'm just saying, was it such
I-
an issue
I
with those people living in that time
I-
that he had to take the love explanation and then attach the
yeah,
punishment?
Is
Is it cultural?
I don't think it's just cultural.
It's because, when John wrote that, he was addressing the issue of the teachers that came in and brought in their own view on certain things.
Mm-hmm,
Because he brought it up so many times.
mm-hmm.
So it seems to have been an issue, and I'm not, not that I understand.
Thank you. Yep.
It seems that it was an issue that was raised, and he just seemed to have dropped it in there.
Yeah. The notion of the day of judgment is a very common theme through nearly every one of Paul's books. So I don't think it was merely a cultural thing. For Paul, it was very much a theological thing.
Mhm.
Paul's probably the primary writer to talk to that topic. Strong verbiage for it in like Corinthians, Thessalonians.
Is it day of judgment or day of Christ that he interchanged?
Sometimes they use them interchangeably. Day of the Lord,
Mhm.
day of Christ, judgment seat of Christ, judgment of Christ. You get a few different phrases. I think if we do First John in the spring, we'll get to address that conversation a bit better, because I don't think this is the first time in First John he's mentioned it.
Mhm.
But it's a worthy question,
But
which
now I want to do a word study because I'm trying to figure out where this fear came
Right.
from.
Yeah, Well-
And that love covers it all. We understand that.
right.
But
Why is Paul concerned that I might have a fear at this judgment? That's a
Trying to say that if you have enough, if you've accepted the love or been perfected in the love, then you don't need to fear.
that's
And
right.
that seems to be his
Right.
overall theme. He
Point.
doesn't want you to fear
Right.
judgment.
Yep. So there is a way to stand before the judgment
right,
and not fear.
Not fear.
right.
And then if you are still afraid, then you need to go back and see what is keeping you,
Yeah.
from accepting that perfect love.
And my current understanding is that the primary thrust of the book of First John is more about perfecting love.
Right.
And one of the results of perfected love is no fear at the judgment.
So these words in these verses right here are very strong.
Mhm.
And I do understand what you were saying, but it's just like,
Mhm.
it's stuck it right there in the middle. And I'm like,
And this is also, we also feel it a little bit more because we started right with just this verse. Had we actually started at 1 John 1:1 and read our way down to this, we would already have some context that might not make this feel so in your face. But because we just jumped right to this, it feels very in your face. Which is just, one more reason why it's rarely ever good to just flip open the book of First John and say, I'm gonna look at that passage. Read the book as a whole, do your unit of thoughts, get your flow of thought, then start to dig into some of these individual pieces.
And isn't it also a portion of keeping you in line, like, if you still fear, the thing to do is keep perfecting your love, keep
Yeah.
perfecting your love, so.
Yeah.
If
the thrust of the book is, I want your love to be perfected, he's probably going to make a few arguments as to why that's important and how you can know if you are or aren't perfecting that love.
see, I'm looking at it as a comparative lifestyle that, it goes to works. works and punishment. And then Paul's saying, okay, but love is here and there is no punishment.
Yeah.
Even though you may not be able to do such and such, or you may have done such and such, there is no fear in love, where I have been taught theologically all my life, if I don't do this, or if I do that, there is fear and punishment.
Yeah.
So it's.
Well, I mean, Paul's very clear. Fear involves punishment. If you think you're going to be punished for something, you will have fear. And so without having a ton of context around that, at a minimum, what we know there is he's using the concept of punishment, fear. If I'm concerned about being punished, I will experience fear. He's using that concept as some type of a thermometer or a test for me to ask myself, how well is my love being perfected?
And that's kind of the way we grew up, because we were legalistic in some of the things that we did, or we were taught. And we were taught if we didn't do them, we would go to hell.
And I think what's key here is that, right, he's not using this comparison to say, if you do these things, if you, this isn't a go to heaven or hell kind of passage, right? This is I want your love to mature and grow and be stronger and better and better.
Mhm.
And prior to all this, he's already talked a lot about what it means to love well, what that looks like. And the concept of fellowship is a single word summary of so much of what he's been talking about. But he's still got to give us some mechanism to kind of gauge how well am I progressing in that. Now, for us, there may be a cultural component in which they understood the concept of a judgment in a way different than we do. Because, culturally in our upbringing, I mean, most church traditions don't talk much about judgment for a believer. They talk about the judgment of in or out. Either you believe and you're in, or you don't and you're out. Or if you're more of a Catholic bent, you're going to have some works included in that, and you're going to have some, did you do enough kind of thing. And judgment always relates to this notion of in or out. But if you believe in eternal security, in the notion that, once you believe, you can't lose that salvation, then this has to mean something different than that. And if we look at the context that it's sitting in, nowhere in the book of, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I don't currently see, or my understanding of the book of 1 John is that 1 John doesn't address the notion of in or out. The book is just not dealing with that topic. Although there are some passages that people want to translate that way or interpret that way. But I struggle to see that when held up against the context well. So now we've kind of looked at the unit of thoughts. So we've looked at everything. We've looked at the main verse, the sentence above, the sentence after, and we've looked at the whole unit of thought. So now we want to just take a peek at the paragraph above and the paragraph below. So let's go back. It should go without saying that, well, I chopped this. I'm giving you 2-ish pages. My total document for this is 15 pages. And I chose not to give you the entire 15 pages because I didn't want to just give away the entire thing we're going to do in the spring. So.
Me, in doing this, I'm not going to say that I've done it like this, but it's, let's say you take a passage, it's like you speak it out loud and you're reasoning out loud.
Absolutely.
I feel like, it's like you're sitting with someone and you're reasoning, going backward, therefore,
it's all about just breaking it down.
Yeah.
And really slowing down. And this is what I use my little insights section for is, I'm just like, okay, well, he says by this. Well, what does that mean? And there's a so that. So that's a purpose statement. What is the purpose? And there's a because, which is a reason statement. So what was the reason? I'm just looking for those keywords to help me understand using the literary structure to help me understand what I think he's trying to say.
As you do it, it seems that, it just draws you in further because it seems like it's like an arrow that keeps.
It is.
pointing. Yeah,
My favorite analogy is this is just one big connect the dots.
right.
It is just, it's logical flow of thought from beginning to end. This is why we do the paragraph summaries. This is why we start to get an understanding of the theme of the book, because when you start drilling into specific passages, now you're adding another dot and you're trying to figure out what are its connectors. And it really is just, I've gotten now to when I read, all I can see are the buts, therefores, becauses, so that's, because every one of those phrases is just okay, I'm about to say something that's a result of what I just said back here. And so it's just like, okay, well, I got to understand that. Oh, no, that one, no, can't stop there. Nope, can't stop there. And it's just all the way back to the start. And that's just the way they wrote. So it is very much that kind of a thing. And that's why I say at a minimum, if you want to say you have looked at the immediate context, you need to at least understand the paragraph it's in and at least the paragraph above and the paragraph below. That's just like the bare bones basic. And most likely, as you do that, you will immediately get caught up in, okay, but I can't really understand that paragraph until I go up and look at that paragraph, which is why I always suggest start by reading the entirety of the book. Try to write that grand book summary before you've written anything else. Just read the entire book. Try to read the summary or try to write some kind of a summary. Then, especially if it's a bigger book or a longer book, I might use not a dictionary. That's no. Well, you could use a commentary, but it's having a brain lapse on the type of book that. Oh, geez, money. It's the book that will give you what? No, it's a category of book that is used to specifically give you the structure of a book. It'll give you all the who's the author, what time was it written, what's the purpose or theme, and here's an outline.
That's part of our Bible.
A lot of Bibles have that content in there. It's not a commentary.
Just
No.
introduction.
Introduction. Yeah, and the introduction is like the book I have at home is called The Cross, the Cradle, and the Grave, and it has every New Testament book. And, it just basically gives you a lot of those high level observations, and it'll give you 2 or 3 possible outlines. And so I'll typically skim an outline just to see if there is some high level structure to the book. But then ultimately, the nitty gritty gets into doing your paragraph summaries. Once you start doing your paragraph summaries, you're really starting to get a sense of flow of thought. And as hard as it is, I try awfully hard to not spend days and hours and months doing paragraph summaries. I read a paragraph, I try not to read it more than once or twice, and I just write down what I think it says. Because you just have to start somewhere. It's a highly iterative process. But then when I zero into a particular passage, I have my paragraph summaries. I kind of already get the flow of the book. I know my high level observation parts and pieces. So, here, when we look at the paragraph before, which is 4:7 through 14, my summary was to manifest the love of God to the world. We must love one another in the same manner that he loved us, with a sacrificial love, which we can do through his Spirit within us. So this is that to manifest the love of God to the world. In our verses, we saw this notion of living as he lived, loving as he loved, being as he was. A lot of that comes from the preceding paragraph. Then if we look at the paragraph after, faith starts and brings to completion the process of overcoming this world by the enabling power of the Spirit within us, thereby enabling us to love God and to love one another. And that's towards the very end of the book.
Say that John wrote, looking at when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he gave love the Lord your God and for your heart, right? And then he amended by saying, love one another as, love your neighbor as yourself. Because it seems that he's so love-centered, which is to, based on, from what I understand, which is to love God and then to love one another. Seems like he's focused on these letters.
So
Is on what Jesus did.
I'm not going to give you this content, but I'm going to show you a few things. This is the 15-page document for my personal study of the book of 1 John, which is just a good example of the overall process that we're trying to put together here. But again, this was the verse that I really wanted to hone in on for this particular study was this. But, I have my key facts, part of which is purpose and theme, right? And so I have the purpose as to motivate his readers to greater fellowship with God and each other so that they may experience complete joy, because joy is a big theme in here, and have no fear at his return and judgment. And the theme was joy and confidence through fellowship, that both joy and confidence are outcomes of this perfected love that is grown through fellowship. And then I'll say, okay, here's the passages or the verses that I kind of derive that purpose from, and the theme. I'll say, are there any key passages? And I'm just kind of repeating some of that content up there. This whole notion of confidence at his return and judgment, I felt stood out to me as kind of like you were saying, that's a pretty strong language. There are some repeating phrases, and he actually structures the book around these four phrases. These things we write. I'm writing these things I have written, these things I have written. Each one of those is kind of I'm done with that topic, I'm going to this topic. But all four of them tie together. They have a theme. I kind of wrote down my presupposition. I felt going into it that the book was about fellowship just because I'd done some study in it before, and that it really wasn't about a test of life to know whether or not we were justified in or out kind of thing. So you don't, but you do have all of what I just covered for Philippians.
So without looking at, and I want to make sure that I don't exegesis, but without looking at the introduction and my first glance, because the introduction would tell me, who we was writing to, why it would give you all that information. I could look at this and say, okay, he may be writing in response to some sort of issues that may have been going on.
That is called the occasion.
Right. In the false teachers. So it was a response to something that was going on because to me, he was like, okay, I'm trying to explain to you what real love is.
Right.
Regardless of what you're experiencing or what other people tell you what Jesus followers should be doing, I'm going to tell you what the real thing.
It should all fit.
It should all fit. Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. The occasion, the purpose and theme, it should all fit. This is the puzzle you're trying to piece together. And if you're interpreting a verse in a way that just feels at odds with the overall purpose or theme or occasion, then you need to work harder.
Because what supports my thought was when you go back to the actual chapter 4, and he starts telling you if someone says, I love God, and then he gives you the examples. No, this is not what love is. This is what love is.
So just so that you have a sense of my own process,
Okay.
So I'll start at the top, right? 1 John 1, 1 through 4. And I basically make a bullet for each verse. I don't really label the bullet as verse 1, verse 2, or so forth, but for the most part, I'm reading a verse and then I'm starting to just put it in my own words, so that I can start to highlight things. And I'll start to call out things that I think are relevant or important in that. And then sometimes that may lead me to a word study. Like I wanted to understand, what does he mean by beginning? And I'll look that up in the BDAG, which is a lexicon, and I'll get a sense of beginning. And then I may look at some of the key verbs: heard, seen, looked, touched. Those are really big verbs that they emphasize right out of the gate in this. All right. So this is, he's not talking about something that he heard hearsay. This is something he has firsthand interaction with, kind of thing. And then I'll try to note, because remember we talked about it's good to look things up in multiple translations. So if I look up a verse in multiple translations, I noticed that these translations, word of life is all lowercase, meaning they translate it to mean the message about life, all lowercase. These have word capitalized, meaning they think the word means Jesus, who is life. But there are others who would say it's word of life, meaning it's the message about life, and that life is Jesus. These are three ways that people interpret that phrase, word of life, that become easy to spot when you do some parallel, when you look it up at different verses or different translations. So, and then I'll just keep going. Verse 2. And I'm just writing things down. Verse 3, verse 4, like I did another word search on fellowship. This is the first time that word appeared. I did a word search on it, and it talks about this notion of a close association involving mutual interest in sharing. And then this is what we've been doing. I will say, okay, out of everything I just studied, what's my summary? And so I'll try to write a 1-sentence short summary. This is what I think this paragraph means. And I just keep going. And what's in this content here, this is just the way I logically work my way through a paragraph. Sometimes it has a word study. Sometimes I'm reading a verse in multiple translations. It's just the way I process through a passage, through a paragraph, verse by verse, through the paragraph, so that ultimately I get to a summary. If there's logic, like if then, I almost always say, here's the if, here's the then, make sure I understand that logic, and then I just keep going. In 1 John, I recognize that he's giving us some steps, right? So up here, it's let me tell you how not to sin and thereby stay in fellowship with God. But if you do, don't forget, Jesus our advocate, because he's perfectly righteous. He lived a perfectly righteous life. So how is it to not sin? And I said, okay, well, here's the first thing he's going to tell us. Step 1. And then I have a summary for that. And he expands on that. And then we get down to step 2. Do not love this world or the things in this world. This is the next way to avoid sin. And I'll go through that passage and summarize each of those units of thought. And I'll basically do this for the entire book without a focus on any one particular verse. And then when I'm done with this, I use the exact same document to then just go back in and say, okay, now I want to deep dive on 418 or 418. And I'll just insert my immediate context stuff in this document. So that if I come down to 4, here you can see is where I start. So I just put immediate content paragraph before. See, I only showed you the summary, but this is all the work that went into me getting to that summary. And then here's our main unit of thought. This is the paragraph the passage lives in. Again, I'm making my way through, writing down what I think it means to get to a summary. Here's my sentence before, and this is what I copied and pasted into the document that you have. My sentence after, my paragraph after, and then I finish. These are the remaining paragraphs down to the conclusion. That's just kind of the overall process and how, at least at this point in time, it's kind of evolved for me. It's highly iterative, but it involves all the steps that we've been discussing. I may have a different Word doc where I put observations in, but I'm trying to get to the point where I just keep basically one running Word doc for a book. And I may have a section in it for my observations, and so forth. But when we're talking about interpretation, what I've just shown you is the crux of how I work through a passage to get to an interpretation. Thank you. 337. That's pretty much it. Let's talk a little bit about the Philippians. Homework suggested if you want to do more work. So what I did using that exact same structure that we just went through for 1 John, I took everything that we've put together so far as a group and put it into the template and gave you the template. So key facts, and I got this out of my Cross, Cradle, and Grave introduction. Because sometimes there's arguments around some of these key facts. Obviously, there's, the key facts can be helpful, but they're not the most important thing. Understanding purpose and theme is important, and getting a sense of occasion is pretty important. So book purpose. I think I took. Oh, yeah, that's what I did. I looked at the purpose statement here, promote gospel-centered unity for the sake of advancing the gospel. And then I said, what passages support that the best? That's where I got the 127 and 28. Book theme, partnership in the gospel and walking worthy of the gospel. Now that was the theme that the introduction suggested. My own personal theme was worded a little different than that, which is fine. The point is it's iterative and you got to start somewhere. Write down a theme, whether you get to it yourself or whether you grab it out of an introduction. I would suggest you do it yourself first and then compare it to an introduction. But you can speed up the process some, especially around author and date and provenance, where were they writing from, and destination, who are they writing to? Those are just simple facts that somebody's already dug up for us. Just copy those. Some of the key passages, I just reiterated the purpose and the theme passages and this notion of walking worthy of the gospel and embracing suffering for his sake. Repeating words and phrases. So I went back to the work we did. We snapped a picture of the whiteboard with all the repeating words and phrases. And the concept of joy and rejoice was probably one of the most prominent verb ones, although joy is technically a noun. But and I listed, I think there were 11 uses of one of those concepts of joy or rejoice. That's pretty prominent. When you have a 4-chapter book that uses one concept 11 times, that's pretty significant. So I just jotted all those down for us. I also noted the phrases in Christ is used 20 times and the gospel is used 9 times. So these concepts of being in Christ and the notion of the gospel are pretty emphasized throughout the book as well. I jotted down a presupposition. The book is about unity and partnership in the gospel and the suffering that will come with this. And then I just took the work that we did where everybody took a paragraph and I used that for the summary until we get down to the verse that I'm suggesting. And I'm saying verse, I mean sentence. Because sentence and verse do not always align. In this case, one sentence is actually 3, 8, 9, 10, 4 verses. So the main thing is 3, 8 through 11. More than that, I count all things to be lost in view of surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. And I count them but rubbish, so that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of suffering, being conformed to his death. And here's the tricky one. In order that I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. See, there he goes again. What do you mean may?
Looks like
It-
you- yeah, already did.
Isn't that a given? If I'm a believer and I die, I'm just gonna. That's one of those. I should put a little extra thought into what that means. That's one of those that were really easy just to fly right by. But we talked about the verb tenses and is it tense? This is the subjunctive. Subjunctive, it is a tense, which means it may or may not apply to reality. It's an if. It's a possibility. It's not a definite. And sometimes, our English word may conveys that sense of may or may not pretty easily.
Let's see that I made. No price.
So it'd be interesting to see, right, and may be found in him, is every use so that I may gain Christ. Are all of these subjunctive? If so, why does he keep using a possibility? What is it that's possible or not possible? Right. That's a little tricky. So, we have kind of all of our paragraph summaries. The immediate sentence before is, but whatever things were gained to me, those things I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ, right? That's 3:7. The immediate context, which is the summary of the paragraph that it sits in, was do not give into the flesh. I have lost the world, but gained Christ. I think Olobu did this section. I realized when I was setting this up that I missed a paragraph. There is actually a paragraph on 2 through 6 and then a separate paragraph on 7 through 11, and I gave him 2 through 11. So fortunately, his summary was really for 7 through 11. 2 through 6 was the part that said, put no confidence in the flesh, which, he kind of says when he says, do not give in to the flesh.
Is there any kind of technical term that, going back to 3, 8 to 11, that we talked about what the word may means, like there's a possibility, and then also look at the word faith, which is a possibility and a choice. Am I not saying that correct? Like there are two words that connect to, I guess, give the idea of possibility of choice. So, I guess I'm asking, is may the right word or the may word used because we're also using or talking about faith?
I don't think it's being used because we're talking about faith in the sense that faith is a, I guess we could say choice. It's a, I believe or I don't believe.
To a certain extent. And then the may also is a choice as well. I was just wondering.
Right,
Yeah.
why didn't they say that I will attain? so that I will be found.
And he kept, you, cause you brought it up,